Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Digitally Uploaded Podcast, the companion podcast for digitallydownloaded.net. I have wrested the controls off Alan. He's not here today, so I'm going to be your host, and you should feel very lucky about that, or not. But we do have a cracking program for you today. We've got a lot of good stuff to talk about, and we've got a lot of cool peeps on. We'll start with our regulars. Hello, Trent, you're back.
Hello. Yes, I am.
It's good to have you back, as always. We also have Harvard. Hello, Harvard.
Hello, guys.
Cool. And we have Kiwi Matt, who's been back from wherever he was. He was on some kind of quest up Mount Doom or something. Hello, Matt. Welcome back.
Hello. I'm back from Mount Doom, apparently.
That's what all New Zealanders do, right?
It was a fun adventure, yeah.
It's like a pilgrimage.
Everyone on their 21st birthday has to go to Mount Doom.
And finally, we have a special guest this week. We have Lee. Lee is a game developer. He's been around in Australia for quite a while creating games, and you'll probably know him best for his work on Hand of Fate 2. I guess that would be your most famous game, I want to say. Or at least I want to say that because I want everybody to play it. If you haven't played it yet, play Hand of Fate 2. But yes, Lee. Hello, Lee.
Hi, Matt. How's it going?
And just so we can update people on what you actually have been doing, what's your most recent game, just so I can get people to go and buy it to get some value for being on this podcast for you.
Yeah, right. My most recent game is Windbound, which is by Five Live Studios. I did a bunch of narrative design and additional writing for that one. It is nice. It's a lot of sailing and being murdered by pigs on distant islands, but mostly sailing.
There you go. See? That sounds good to me. All right, we will. we do have a lot of podcasts to do, so let's wrap this little introduction up, and we'll listen to some lovely Hatsune Miku tunes. I don't know what yet, so sorry about that. And then we will be back, and we will talk about the games of next month. Welcome back to Bit of Music. Okay, so the games of March, as always, there's a lot of games coming out, and we will jump straight into it. I'm going to read off the whole list of all the games that are coming out on PlayStation 5, 4, and Nintendo Switch. We don't care about Microsoft here. And then we're going to talk about our favourite, or the games that we're looking forward to the most. And if there is an Xbox game that's actually worth looking forward to, I'm sure Trent will fill us in as the one person that actually plays that console. All right, so here we go. First up, we have a game called Marquette. It's coming out on PlayStation 5 on March 2, and it is a first-person recursive puzzle game, and it actually looks pretty good. I'm going to be playing this for review for digitallydownloaded.net, and it has a nice aesthetic, so I'm hoping it's good, otherwise I'll be wasting my time. We also have the Yakuza Like a Dragon port coming to PlayStation 5 finally on March 2, so you can enjoy turn-based Yakuza in HD on your Sony console. That's a good thing. Scrolling through. Then you have very little to look forward to until Crash Bandicoot 4 that comes out on March 12. And I'm sure there's a lot of Crash Bandicoot fans out there that will be looking forward to that. We have Monster Truck Championship, if you're into that, I guess, March 16. Uh, March 18 brings the PlayStation 5 version of Marvel's Avengers. If anybody is actually interested in that game, there you go. You can look forward to that. And then we really don't have too much else until the end of the month, where Balan Wonderland comes out on March 26. Now, the demo for that was absolutely terrible, but who knows? Maybe they've used feedback from that demo to improve it. I would like to see them do that because it actually looks nice. It's got a charming presence, and the character looks pretty fun. It's just the game is not very good right now, but who knows? They may have fixed it. That would be good. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 comes out on March 26th. If you haven't already played that, there you go. You can play it in PlayStation 5 definition. And that's it for the PlayStation 5. So another fairly quiet month for the console, but I imagine that the interesting games will start coming towards the end of the year for that device. On the PlayStation 4, meanwhile, there's quite a bit to look forward to. Harvest Moon One World comes out on March 2. Now, Harvest Moon is not Story of Seasons. Story of Seasons is what Harvest Moon once was. Now, Harvest Moon is a different thing, and it's not as good, but it's still a farming thing, so it should be interesting and fun for people who enjoy that stuff. So that comes out on March 2. Neptunia Virtual Stars comes out on March 2 as well. If you're into really offbeat, funny humor, there you go. You can look forward to that. It's a very Japanese JRPG thing. I could actually talk about this stuff without Alan flipping out at me. This is a nice week. Kill It With Fire comes out on March 4. That's basically like a first-person shooter, but instead of shooting people, you're torching spiders, which is pretty cool. I'm looking forward to that. As an Australian, I sympathise with the people that made that game for the reasons that they no doubt made it. What else we got? Genso Skydrift comes out on March 9. I think that's a Toho Project racing game. Okay, we'll give it a go. What else we got? Neverwinter Sharanda comes out on March 9. Is that the MMO? That might be the MMO. Gets an expansion. Or it might be an independent game. I don't know. I actually haven't looked into that, but Neverwinter is pretty cool. So I will check that out when it gets closer to release. We also have Root Film coming out on PlayStation 4 on March 19.
What's funny, Harvard?
Nothing. It's gonna be a good game. It's gonna be a good game.
And it's not what you may imagine from the title, Root Film.
Root Film is going to be full of excitement.
It's going to be very, very...
Sequel to Root Letter, which was a great game.
It is a sequel to Root Letter, but it is actually not related to it. It's a completely independent game. So if you haven't played Root Letter, you probably should, but you can get into Root Film without having played it. And yeah, it looks like it's going to be quite good. It's got a nice aesthetic again, and yeah, the first one was actually pretty successful by visual novel standards, so pretty mainstream, and hopefully this one is as well. We also have Kays and the Wild Masks coming out on PlayStation 4 on March 26. I don't know much about this game, but it has a nice little box art, so that's why I mentioned it. Balan Wonderland also comes out on PlayStation 4, and same thing there. I hope it got better than its demo. All right, then we run through to Nintendo Switch, and then we'll talk about which one's interesting to us. Harvest Moon also comes out on Switch on March 2, and there's an awful lot of indie games coming out on the Switch. The Switch is just getting deluged with this stuff, so I'm scrolling through a lot of things here, and not a lot of them are interesting, but there's a lot coming out, rest assured. Kill It With Fire also comes out on Switch on March 4. There's a game called Task Force Delta Afghanistan coming out on March 4. I'm sure I'll love that. It looks like one of those first-person shooters, but indie rather than by Activision. Apex Legends comes out on Switch on March 9, and I know there are a lot of people who liked Apex Legends, and there you go. You'll be able to play it on your Switch. It will be free to play and stuff. Battle Brothers comes out on Switch on March 11. That's a tactics RPG where you lead a mercenary company in a gritty, low-power medieval fantasy world. So, yep. I'm still scrolling. Crash Bandicoot does come out on Switch as well, and it actually has a different look to it. I saw comparisons between the screenshots from PlayStation 4 and 5 and Nintendo Switch. Actually, it might just have been PlayStation 5 and Nintendo Switch, but with the Switch version, they've gone with a more kind of cel-shaded anime look, which is neat, I guess. So I'm not sure if they did it for technical reasons or because they thought that the aesthetic might appeal more to Switch players, but I think that's
the Game Boy era where like the games were like completely different to the consoles. That's a good time.
It is still the same game. It's not actually a completely different game. It's not like they've done a 2D platformer for the Switch versus 3D for the other consoles, but it does look different, and I think that's the version I'll go for if I do play it. Here's an interesting one. On March 16, Saviors of Sapphire Wings and Stranger of Sword City Revisited comes out. Now, that is a long title, but there is a good reason for that. That's actually 2 games, and you get a pack of them together in the one. Those are dungeon crawlers in the wizardry vein, and having played Stranger of Sword City on the PlayStation Vita when it was new, they're very good. They come to us from Experience Inc., so they've got absolutely gorgeous production values and very tightly refined dungeon crawling mechanics. So you should definitely look forward to that if you do like wizardry on any level. If you haven't yet played Kingdoms of Amalur, the Switch port comes out on March 16. I'll probably pick that up again just to have the game on the go. I really like Kingdoms of Amalur.
That's a good one, right?
Yes, that is a good one.
What's the bad one? Was it bad, like, Kingdoms game?
There's a lot of bad games with the word Kingdoms in the title.
No, I just remember 2 RPGs. One was, they're both called Kingdoms. One is good and one is bad. But this is a good one.
I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but yeah, Kingdoms of Amalur is definitely a good one. It's like a single-player MMO, and yeah, it's got this open world thing going for it, but it does it in a nice way rather than a exhausting way. And yeah, it's a very good game. I've already got a review up on digitally-downloaded.net if you want to check it out. Root Film also comes out on Switch, so you can enjoy the Root on the go. Plants vs. Zombies, Battle for Neighborville Complete Edition comes out on Switch. That's the shooter, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
That's like the tower defense shooter thing where you play co-op. Or is that the... I can't remember.
Yeah,
I played
shooter. Yes,
shooter.
I played the first Plants vs. Zombies shooter game, I think, and back on the PlayStation 3. And with that one, there was a tower defense mode. You didn't have to play like competitive versus multiplayer. There was a tower defense mode. I don't know if that'll come back. That was pretty cool. That was more fun than the multiplayer, the deathmatch thing. Story of Seasons, Pioneers of Olive Town comes out on Switch on March 23. So that's the good Harvest Moon, and you can look forward to that exclusively on Switch. I will have a review of that up. I'm already playing it a bit, but I can't talk about that because embargoes. The House in Fata Morgana, Dreams of the Revenants edition comes out on Switch on March 25. That is a visual novel, and I missed the original release of that. You played it, didn't you, Matt?
I didn't, but I've heard lots of very good things about it. It came out on PC a few years ago.
Yeah, gotcha.
it's
Anyway,
one of those games that nobody has played, but the 3 people who have played it
love it.
swear by it and spend all their time on Twitter telling everyone else to try and play it.
Okay, cool. Well, it does look good. It's a gothic suspense tale, which is just a nice idea. And yeah, I'll give it a go. What else we got? I think that's about it. Oh, Monster Hunter Rise.
Oh, damn.
The big one right at the end. That comes out on March 26th. So that's the latest Monster Hunter game. You can still play that demo, can't you? That was on...
I think you can't anymore, because it's until March, right?
Did they stop it, did they? Okay. The demo was good. You got to take on 2 of the monsters. I am absolutely terrible at Monster Hunter. I couldn't beat the second one, so there you go. I'm really not good at Monster Hunter. But it was fun. I enjoyed getting beaten.
which is part of the Monster Hunter experience.
Yeah.
My friend says the suspicion is that they make the second monster in the demo extra hard so that everyone gets wrecked by it, and then they all go, oh, I need to go get my revenge, so they actually buy the full game.
It's quite possible.
Mm.
I mean, the way I usually play Monster Hunter is I get a team of 4 people together, and then I just make sure that the other 3 are really good, and then I let them do it, and I just kind of stand at the back. That's my Monster Hunter strategy. It only works to a point. Like with the lower level monsters, it's okay because you don't need to work as a team so much. But then I start to get beaten pretty badly and give up. Anyway, I've lost my voice having read all of that list out. Lee, as the guest on the podcast, give us a pick. You get 1 pick. So, just pick, one.
Jeez.
Yep. If you can only play 1 game next month, which game is it going to be?
Oh, God damn it. I guess it'd have to be Monster Hunter Rise then. I've been a fan of the Monster Hunter series since the 3DS, at least. That was when it became a lot more accessible, and they were really kind of pitching to the Western audiences in a much broader fashion. And I think that they're brilliant games to play on the go. I really enjoyed the last one on the PlayStation, and I think this one is going to, like, I struggled a bit with the last Switch Monster Hunter game for whatever reason. I think I was spoiled then by World, but Rise seems to be the business, so I'm hoping that I'll be able to play that online with people because everyone has a Switch now. So that's my pick.
That last Monster Hunter on Switch, that was just a remake, wasn't it?
It was maybe like a sort of the equivalent of a Super Street Fighter or something, right?
That's what I thought. So this is the first kind of new Monster Hunter since Monster Hunter World just kind of changed how Monster Hunter was seen by everybody. Yeah. This is the first one since then to get a release. And it's a Switch exclusive. There you go. All the good games coming to Switch. Trent, I know which one Trent's going to pick. Obviously, Trent's about the Call of Duty Afghanistan game.
Call of Duty is coming out in like March this year. What a
no, it's not Call of Duty. What's it called? Delta Ops Afghanistan or something. Task Force Delta Afghanistan. Yeah,
I feel like you could just put words together and do like Hotel Army Guns Afghanistan, and it'll be the same thing.
Yeah,
Hotel Bravo.
I'm sure that's the game that Trent's got on his list, isn't it?
No. I'm actually quite looking forward to It Takes Two. I really liked the. I was gonna be all like, oh, it's really good, like the original game, like A Way Out, and then I'm like, oh, it's the same developer, so that makes sense. So yeah, but I really liked the concept in A Way Out where you had the split screen, and that was really fun, and it was a cool new take on multiplayer for the time, I guess. So I'm more down for It Takes Two, but it's a little bit more I don't know if my dude bro friends will want to play that style of a game, but we'll see.
And I didn't actually mention that one on my list. It does come out on March 26th, and I should have mentioned it because it does look good. So good choice there, Trent.
That was Trent.
That was Trent. I'm getting the two of you confused. It is early when we're recording this, so you'll have to forgive the fact that I make some stupid mistakes, like mistake Trent from Harvard for Harvard. Harvard, what's your favorite game for the month?
I realized the bad Kingdom game I was thinking about was Kingdom Come Deliverance, which may or may not be on Switch. But if Kingdoms of Amalur is good, maybe I'll check that out, because I am in the mood for something big in RPG this month, so we'll see how things go.
Yeah, you'll certainly get big RPG out of Kingdoms of Amalur. It's a long game. It's a chunky. It is definitely a single player MMO, and that is done in a way that is actually good. Usually that doesn't work, but in this case it does, and I think you'll get a lot of value out of it. So enjoy. And
it's old enough that it'll run on Switch, right?
You'd hope so, but this is the remake. I mean, the remake looked pretty good on PlayStation 4, so they did do a fair bit of work in sprucing it up. I am a little bit concerned about the performance, but for what it's worth, I'm going to pick it up anyway because I'm going to hope.
Do you know what I've really enjoyed lately is watching loading time comparisons on YouTube between Switch and PS4 and PS5, and it's a lot of fun because PS5 is just instantaneous, PS4 is respectable, and Switch is just doing its best. It's just like instantaneous, 4 seconds, 35 seconds. And you're just there cheering the Switch on going, you can do it, you can do it.
Yeah, but it's okay because once you get into it with the Switch, it's good. That's what I like to think anyway. Yeah, Matt, your turn. Pick one, anyone.
I will pick A Story of Seasons because
There
The
you
Good
go.
Harvest Moon is always good, and this one does a lot of cool new things that push the series forward a lot more than what recent games have. I've also been playing a little bit, and I don't know how much I'm allowed to say at this stage.
Oh, hang on.
But
I'll just check for you, Matt. Embargo lifts on the 1st. This will not be out. Oh, you can talk about it. There you go.
yeah,
By the time this podcast is live for other people to listen to, embargo would have lifted. So go off.
yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's the whole wilderness element of it, which has you rather than, I mean, you inherit a farm, but it's one that's been completely overgrown and reclaimed by nature, more so than the ones in previous games. So you're sort of carving out your own farm from the wilderness and venturing out into the forest to tame livestock, and it gives you a lot of freedom to customize your farm and actually design the layout and that kind of stuff, which previous games haven't.
I tell you what,
yeah.
the game is a little bit cruel in one sense that on your very first day you're wandering around just kind of clearing up some weeds and whatever and getting ready to start farming on the second day, and you see a chicken there. It's like, oh, this chicken's so cute. He's so cute. Yeah. I'm going to tame him. I'm going to add him to my farm. And then they're like, no, you can't until you fix your barn up, mate. As I want my chicken, but he's just sitting there waiting for me. Wild. I'm very sad about this.
He is a very patient wild chicken.
He just sits there. He's very good.
It'd be so good if it just to be a troll. Like as soon as you build the barn, the chicken's like gone.
That would be right. That would be my luck. I've already named him, so in my head, I've already given him a name. So I need that chicken in my farm. All right, and my pick, I guess. I'm going to go with Love Live School Idol Festival After School Activity YY Home Meeting. That's my pick because I do like
the whole thing.
I'm gonna. I did that just for Alan. I'm gonna. He's gonna listen back. He's gonna fume and he's gonna absolutely hate that I got to say that twice in one podcast. But I am seriously looking forward to the game. I like my rhythm games. I love Love Live. So there you go. That's gonna be fun. All right. That was a long section. So we'll go to some more music. And the music is going to be from Love Live, and then we're going to come back and talk about some topics. Welcome back, everybody. Right, so a pretty big game released this week, at least if you're a fan of the JRPG. It's called Bravely Default 2. It is exclusive to the Switch, and it is excellent. It is a very, very, very high-quality game indeed. I do have a review up on digitally-downloaded.net just to shield my site a little bit, but I'm not the only one that's been playing it on the podcast. Matt has as well, and I'm sure everybody else here is going to pick it up when they get a chance as well. Matt, I guess the reason we wanted to talk about this subject is because people will inevitably write up Bravely Default 2 as this retro-style RPG because it's got turn-based combat. It is very heavily inspired by Final Fantasy, and it just has that kind of look and feel of an old-school RPG. But in reality, it's kind of not, I think, is probably the best lead into this section. So I know you agree with me that it's pretty subversive to the traditional JRPG tropes.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It definitely is. I mean, I'll probably say it is very much like in structure and tone and feel. I guess it is very much that classic JRPG, and so if that's what you want, it's not like a kind of, it's not a game that's going to go so far out of its way to comment on the genre that you're not going to get that from it. If you just want to go and play a new version of Final Fantasy V, essentially, it'll do that. But it's also a game that just goes beyond just replicating that formula, but kind of uses that as a basis to subvert it and comment on the whole genre, I guess. Just in little ways of how it uses kind of those archetypal heroes of light characters that then kind of break away from the mold a little bit in quite subtle and quiet ways at first, but then as the game builds up, you sort of start to see that more and more, and then when you get to the end, it kind of throws everything out the window in true Bravely fashion, as anyone who's played the first two games will have encountered it.
Yeah, they do like doing things really weird in the second half of the games in these series, don't they? But I guess that's the kind of the point is like with a lot of retro style RPGs, and I'm going to reference Tokyo RPG Factory here because as much as I love them, the likes of I Am Setsuna, Lost Sphere, and Oninaki are very much games for people that are nostalgic for old style RPGs. What I love about the Bravely series is they hit that really nice balance between being quite clearly retro-styled and old-school Final Fantasy, but also being something relevant to people who are newer to the JRPG genre. And I think that you don't have to be a fan of old RPGs to enjoy what Bravely is offering.
Yeah, I think you're right. In saying that, I think the things it does best are things that you'll most appreciate if you are a really diehard fan, and I think without that, a lot of the kind of subversiveness will just go over people's heads.
Well, there is that too, for sure. I totally agree with you that if you are that old school fan of RPGs, you will get that interesting look at the entire genre courtesy of Bravely Default 2. As I think I wrote in my review, it kind of comes across to me as this thesis about what made old JRPGs good. Looking at it as kind of a metatextual thing. It was very much this argument for these are the qualities that make a JRPG good. We're going to make sure that we emphasize those and de-emphasize the bits that are perhaps not very time. They were products of the time, and we can do them better now. So we're going to refocus this so that it remains a traditional JRPG, but at the same time is a modern retro JRPG, which sounds weird, but it just works. It must be very difficult to do. Sorry?
What's in and what's out with this game then? Like, what's the classic RPG stuff that they've gone, this is core and we've got to keep it, and what stuff have they gone, let's not have this anymore?
Okay, so for me, I think the thing that stood out the most was the way they've streamlined progression through dungeons and stuff. So with the older JRPGs, there would be an awful long grind, particularly at the start, where you had to kind of keep ducking in and out of dungeons to fight enemies. Level up, go back to town, heal, go back into the dungeon, fight enemies, level up, go back into town. The Bravely system, as long as you've kept your characters leveled, and you're not playing on the hardest difficulty level, so on normal or easy, as long as you've kept your characters leveled, you actually make quite quick progress through dungeons, and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. You're defeating enemies without the attrition kicking in too much. And then you get to the boss, and the boss absolutely wallops you. And that's when you need to grind or think about tactics, and it becomes a much more complex thing. So what they've done is really focus the energy of the combat system on those boss battles and really emphasize those, while making the progress, it's still there, it's still important, and it's still a part of the game. There's still some grinding involved if that's what you're interested in as far as retro RPGs are concerned, but they've done it in a way that's quite streamlined and rapid. So that for me is the most clear thing, where if I was compare to an older like Final Fantasy 1 or whatever, or 2 or 5, where the progress can be quite slow between boss battles at times. With Bravely Default, it seems to be a bit more streamlined.
Is it like the 3DS game where you have to make a game plan for every boss battle, basically? So
For sure.
Yeah, that was my favorite thing about that game. Until they overdid it, is that every fight you get destroyed the first time because you make an assumption. Like the game gives you, that's my favorite thing about the DS game. The game gives you an anti-mage weapon for the black mage fight, and you're like, this is gonna work fine, and you use it and you get destroyed, and you have to go back to the drawing board and think, okay, I have these classes and these items, and how do I make my best strategy for this guy?
Yeah, you absolutely have to. They'll absolutely trounce you the first time you fight any boss battle. It will wipe the floor with you because you won't have the right mix of character classes and whatever. So each character can take 2 classes into battle now. I think they could before, couldn't they?
They could, yeah. They could take like a main and a secondary.
Yeah, that's exactly that system has been retained. So you can have a main and secondary, and then how you mix the effectively 8 classes will determine whether you beat that boss or you're going to have a hell of a time trying to defeat them.
Yeah. And not just how you mix those classes, but then how you take those classes and their abilities and mix them with the whole brave and default thing to steal turns and to do all that kind of stuff. I think one of the interesting new things that they've added this time, battle system wise, is lots and lots of counters. In terms of
yes,
in your typical old JRPG, you'd maybe get a couple of bosses that have, will counter an attack as a gimmick against when you attack them. In here, there are basically counters for any kind of ability, any sort of ability that you can do. So some bosses will counter when you cast magic, or when you give yourself buffs, or some of the later game bosses have just counter anything. So as soon as you do anything at all, they will do some sort of action in response. And so that adds another, for boss battles, but in particular, a layer of figuring out your strategy to work around those and deal with those, which I think is quite interesting. I think for me, the most interesting thing about how that kind of modern retro thing is really in the storytelling and the characters and the way it unfolds, in terms of it's very much this very overt sort of classic Final Fantasy 4 heroes of light on a journey around the world to restore power to the crystals to stop an ancient evil kind of thing. And it's very much set up as this story about heroes chosen by fate or prophecy or whatever you have, which is that kind of classic JRPG setup. But then it sort of, as the game progresses over the course of however many dozens of hours it takes, that kind of morphs slowly and becomes more about a story about rejecting the idea of fate, and about becomes more a thing about heroes are people who choose to do heroic things regardless of what destiny says, even if that means going in the face of fate or prophecy or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit like Final Fantasy 13, hey?
Yeah.
Only where Final Fantasy 13 tried to be this hyper-modern JRPG, this one does it in the context of something more traditional. But yeah, the narrative tropes or the narrative beats are quite similar, and I like that. Because determinism, the idea that everything's kind of set in stone and you're kind of following a path that you don't really necessarily have control over. That is a philosophy that's driven just about every JRPG since forever. And it is something that I get the feeling that a lot of JRPG developers try to challenge. So especially Square Enix, they're kind of sick of doing that with Final Fantasy. So Final Fantasy 13 definitely challenged that idea. Final Fantasy 7 Remake absolutely trashed it. And this game also does it, but just in a context which is where those two games try to be very modern and push the gameplay side of the RPG forward as well. This game does so within the context of a more classical RPG, which is great. I think that's brave storytelling in a lot of ways, because there is that risk when you try and modernize anything within a game that's specifically trying to be retro, that you're going to upset a lot of people that like their JRPGs the way that they used to play them.
I was going to say with that, because the trend with Final Fantasy, the mainline series, has just been Square Enix going, we're going to make what we want to make. So they've made the Bravely series as a side thing to be producing old style RPGs as well. It's kind of like appealing to the 1 to 6 fan base, right? But would you say that they don't actually worry that much about what that fan base might think and how closely they follow that old formula?
No, they do, I think, but they want to at the same time. They want to be inspired by those games, and they want to inspire people that enjoyed those games, but they don't want to be beholden to them. They want to still make a game that has its own thing to say. And I think that's the difference between, because like I mentioned earlier in this section, the Tokyo RPG Factory developers, they also want to make games that are inspired by the games of yesteryear, but they feel very much kind of beholden by them. They don't challenge them anywhere near as much. This game actually challenges them in a way that's interesting and invigorating while remaining respectful for the basis of the experience.
I think it's something that like Square Enix are, they're able to do, given the catalog of games that they've got, is they can talk about their own work with authority and challenge their own ideas and get away with it, because like, who's going to tell them that they don't know what a Final Fantasy or what a JRPG is, right?
Well, a lot of people try.
But I think it's something that like one allows them to be experimental and flexible like that, but it also kind of shields them from being too, I guess, harshly criticized for subverting their own tropes. Because at the same time, they're also, they will still be making a game that's going to have, crystals telling people what to do, and groups of people who are, pursuing ominous monologuing like weirdos, and all of that like it's still present, even if it is there subverting itself, which I think is a lot of fun.
I also think that Square Enix is in a fortunate position that they are such a factory of this genre that if they make a game that really annoys a percentage of the fan base, I think on some level most of the people in that fan base realize that they'll be able to just play the next one. If Final Fantasy 15 being probably the perfect example of that game was not for a lot of Final Fantasy fans, and I think a lot of those fans that were upset with it, there were obviously some that just went absolutely feral, because this is the games industry and that's what happens. But I think a good chunk of those people that didn't enjoy Final Fantasy 15 knew on some level that they'd be able to look forward to Bravely Default or Final Fantasy 16 or Dragon Quest 11. There was always going to be another game from Square Enix that would right the wrongs as such and give them what they want to play as well. And I think Square Enix has been very good at making sure that it doesn't repeat itself. It always has these different balls in motion, and it's trying different things, and it blends tradition and modernity and stuff. Whereas some other developers, for example, Bandai Namco, they can't really mess with their Tales series, because that is their one JRPG franchise, and if they screw that up, their fan base don't have anything else to look forward to as such. That's my
Yeah,
thoughts anyway.
That is a good point. I hadn't even thought of that.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting, actually.
That's a
Actually, I
freelance
also
build.
wanted to ask, because Bravely Defaults and the first one came out, it was kind of this discussion about turn-based combats, and there's two sides of games criticism. One where it's like turn-based combat is a thing of the past and we should move beyond it, and another one that's saying we can still keep this relevant. We just need to find ways to make it work. And I wanted to ask your opinion if you think there's still a space for turn-based combat, and especially Lee, because I think most of your games have had really good action RPG systems. Like Hand of Fate had a great action system. Would that have worked in a similar way if you implemented turn-based combat?
I think there's a significant portion of our audience that probably would have embraced the game more had we gone a more traditional turn-based route, which wasn't anything that the studio was interested in pursuing at the time. But every now and then I have a weird moment of nostalgia where I try and figure out how such a thing would have functioned, particularly given that since Defiant's closure, and even the year prior to it, there have been a bunch of games that are like, we're a roguelike with cards and you're doing all this stuff, and they're all turn-based games. So every now and then I'm like, what would it have been like if we'd have tapped into that zeitgeist?
I think Darkest Dungeon was probably the one that really kicked that new trend of turn-based roguelike off.
Yeah.
Darkest Dungeon definitely was a hugely influential game in terms of the ability to have hard, difficult, challenging, turn-based combat in these games. It brought it back, I think.
Yeah, I think that there's still plenty of life to be squeezed out of turn-based combat, particularly when people are, remixing it or reimagining it. Darkest Dungeon is a great example where, it has a bunch of fun positioning stuff that it really drilled down into. There's a lot of opportunity for fun tactical options in turn-based that don't become available or become much more strenuous to manage in real time, and you can achieve different things with it. Certainly, I would love to be able to work on a turn-based game in future, and I think a bunch of other X-Defiant devs are also sort of looking in that general direction these days. So we'll see what happens there.
I would say, though, one thing back to Bravely Default, I didn't feel like I should be playing this game on my TV as such. The reason being that this game is so traditional about its turn-based combat, and it feels like it is very much a game of yesteryear in terms of the way it presents the combat system. A lot of other JRPGs that I've been playing that still have turn-based combat systems do absolutely everything they can to try and conceal the kind of sedate pacing of that. I'm thinking games like Atelier Ryza, for example. It has a turn-based combat system, but it really kind of uses visual trickery to mask that and make it look like it's a lot more dynamic and exciting than perhaps Bravely Default tries to do it, where in Bravely Default they kind of stand there and they just swing their sword and then the damage appears over the enemy's head and it moves on. Bravely Default has all this Atelier Ryza has all this movement going on and all these kind of dynamic camera angles, and they try and be very cinematic with it. Other developers try and do a turn-based combat system in a way that looks like it's action-based. So I'm thinking Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 7 Remake. They're actually turn-based in terms of the ebb and flow of the combat system, but it just doesn't stop moving. So they hide the they hide the ATB bar as such, but it's still there. It's still a mechanic. So they try and hide the fact that they're turn-based by making it look like they're action-based combat systems. So
Dragon Quest did the same thing as well, which is fun that it seems like positioning means anything at all in that game, and it does not.
Exactly right. They make it look like you can move around. It's almost tactical in terms of the combat system, but no, it's really just actually exactly what Bravely Default did, but
I spent so much time in Dragon Quest XI, like moving around trying to see if I could dodge attack. If I move my hero over to the side, like far away from the others, then these like kind of big group attacks won't hit. No, it's just you can move if you want to for no purpose whatsoever.
Yeah, so I think Bravely Default is kind of unique in the fact that it is willing to just be two lines of enemies standing against each other and then swinging their little swords at one another. So yeah, I think that kind of turn-based thing is quaint, and they put it in there in that way to be quaint. I think turn-based combat as a thing will remain, but I think that developers will continue to try and find ways of disguising it so that people who are perhaps put off by the idea of boring turn-based combat will still find a way to enjoy what they're doing.
Just imagining like an ATV bar with the disguise, only like a trench coat, and one day they just open up, it's like, surprise, it was me all along.
And in the rest of the game, you have to play with like the bar actually there and just slightly slowed down.
Well, the thing is, it actually works. Like I saw so many people think that Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy 15 are action games, and it kind of worked too well with Final Fantasy VII Remake. I know a lot of people actually got really stuck with it because they were trying to play it as an action kind of button masher, and it wasn't working. It's only once you learn to slow down and play it like a turn-based game that it starts to make sense as a combat system. So, yeah, I think you need to be careful when you do that as well, because there is the potential that people will end up thinking it's meant to be Dynasty Warriors, and it's not, and then they get very upset with you.
I saw that recently one of the directors on Final Fantasy 16 was in a radio interview having to reassure people that the new game is going to be like playable for people who don't care for action games, which is, yeah, they've certainly like changed the perception on the series, even if they haven't actually mechanically altered how they work under the hood.
Yeah, it's really amazing how people have come to assume that Final Fantasy 15 or the Final Fantasy series is about increasingly fast action when it really never has been. It's fun. I mean, this guy, the guy that's doing Final Fantasy 16, his probably most notable game is The Last Remnant, and that is as turn-based game as yet. So I'm really going to be interested to see how he goes about disguising it so it looks like it's a little bit more pacey for the new age Final Fantasy fan.
Harvard, your comment about putting an ATV bar in a trench coat, that is the kind of thing that wouldn't even surprise me if a future Bravely game did something like that.
Just literally an ATV bar in a trench coat.
Literally, yeah. Like this is. I don't want to say too much about Bravely Default 2, like just for spoilers and stuff, but it is a game that, especially towards the end, isn't afraid to just completely break the fourth wall in that sort of way. And to, like, if I talk a little bit about Bravely Second, which was the previous game,
Which no one played.
about which no one played, and the people who played it hated it, and which is bizarre to me because it was brilliant. But that was a game where, I mean, you have a lot of sort of fake endings and that kind of stuff, which is all kind of just standard now for Bravely. But there's a point in that game where, in order to progress, you get a game over and you get kicked back to the main screen. In order to progress, you have to go to the load screen and attempt to delete your save, at which point the villain kind of interrupts your efforts to delete everything, and then the game progresses from there. And it's that kind of thing that I think is one of the most interesting things about the Bravely series as a whole. But Bravely Default 2 does similar sorts of things, maybe not quite to the same extent, but I think, yeah, that's one of the most interesting things about the way it kind of sets up the very classic formula so that it can break it, essentially.
Now that you bring that up, I remember the most devious thing that I remember from Bravely Default 1, which was the game was inspired by the DS game Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light. And the one complaint that everyone had about 4 Heroes of Light was that your party of 4 heroes had the worst communication issues and would always split up like a Scooby-Doo gang and then get completely destroyed, and then all your gear would be sent away. And the first thing that happens in Bravely Default, when the 4 heroes get together, one of them just leaves the inn and it gives you the message, Ring a Bell has left your party. And then my brain was like, nope, you're not doing this to me. And then he just walks back in. And then they just stuck us four together for the entire rest of the game. I'm just like, you're messing with me right now. You are very clearly destroying this.
I'm pretty sure down the track, Yoko Taro is going to get involved with a Bravely Default game. I mean, it's just, there's a natural synergy there between the way he thinks about games and the way that these games like to subvert things. And I would certainly like to
save game thing is very, very near. Yeah.
Yes, that is.
And anyway, on that note, we need to move on because we've got plenty more to talk about on this podcast. And as much as we'd love to talk about RPGs forever and a day, we do need to move on to the next thing. So we'll go to some music from Bravely Default, and we will come back with the next section. And welcome back, everybody. Okay, so there was another really interesting release that happened, about a week ago now? And it came as a result of the Nintendo Direct. They were like, hey, look, we got this coming, you can download it now. And then, of course, people did, and have been talking about it a bit ever since because it is a particularly good thing that they've done. And it's Capcom has got a whole bunch of their titles together, their old arcade games, and thrown them into this virtual arcade system. It's called Capcom. What is it called? Capcom
Arcade Stadium.
That's the one. And it's really good. You get to play all your favorite Capcom games of yesteryear, be them the really obvious ones like 1941 or Ghosts and Goblins. That's the one, isn't it? That's the arcade one. Ghouls and Goblins, or whatever. That one. The guy that wears the knight's armor and then when he gets hit by an enemy goes into his underwear and then gets defeated. That's the game. And then it also has a couple of their more obscure ones. So things like Dynasty Wars or just some of the kind of the oddball games that have been in Capcom's catalog. And you can buy these in big blocks of 10 games. And obviously once you buy them, credits are unlimited. But yeah, the presentation of the collection is what's probably most interesting to me, because it does have this feel that you're moving through an arcade when you're going through the menus, rather than just selecting a game off a kind of static menu. You actually scroll through arcade cabinets, and then when you select the one that you want to play, the arcade cabinet kind of zooms in, but you still see the arcade cabinet around the edges, and it has that experience that, as somebody who did spend a bit of time in arcades as a kid, it's quite nostalgic. So that's, I guess, what we wanted to talk about in the context of this podcast. Is there are a lot of retro compilations coming out, and it is very important that the developers try to preserve the experience of these games, not just in terms of the gameplay, but also what these games offered players back in those days. And I think that this arcade stadium is probably the best example of how to approach this that we've seen yet. Is that fair to say? People disagree with me?
No, that's pretty fair. There was an attempt a couple of years ago that I thought was really interesting on like the Xbox Live on the 360 to have a complete arcade experience similar to this, where you would be like moving around. It was done by a bunch of I think it was Chrome actually was associated with it, and it was initially Microsoft's idea to get this thing together, and then all of the licensing, I think they all pulled out like one by one, and so they constructed this perfect, like wonderful physical representation of an arcade to walk around in, and they didn't have any games for it.
Oh no,
so, yeah.
That's horrible. That's so unfortunate.
Yeah, because initially they were going to have like massive releases all attached to it, where they would have these wonderful one-to-one recreations of classic cabinets, and then in the end they had maybe like 6 games, and they were all like weird and obscure, and so that was an idea that was like perfectly like ahead of its time, and so I love any collection that tries to like present itself as an arcade of an archive of arcades and the cabinets as like physical artifacts. So this is really fun and exciting for me.
Well, that's a big part of the experience of going to an arcade. Is you got your money in your hand or whatever, especially when you're a kid and money came at a premium. It was basically what your parents would actually give you to shut you up for a while. But you'd have the money in your hand, and you'd actually be carefully considering which of these arcade cabinets you wanted to play. And you'd have the little demo screen that you'd be looking at. And if you're anything like me, you'd end up playing just Space Invaders anyway, because that was the safe choice. I got really good at Space Invaders. But yeah, that was a big part of the experience, and a lot of these kind of compilation collections just think that the only reason that people would want these is the game, and I don't necessarily think that's the case.
Yeah,
I mean, a good example of a great arcade I actually had fairly recently was 3 years ago. I went to the Kawasaki City arcade, which was a famous one in Japan at the time, that was all modelled like it was like a 7-story arcade, and it was all modelled on Kowloon, the infamous Chinese slum or Hong Kong slum, and inside you'd have like it was just such a visual experience to be in there in that space, and it was more than just the arcade games. It was also the actual environment that you're walking around. Unfortunately, that is closed now, and this arcade collection made me think, well, what if they were to start doing things like with VR as well? If you could put the VR headset on and they could actually model an arcade room, and then you'd go and pick your arcade cabinet, and then you'd virtually sit down and that would work for VR, because a lot of the strengths of VR are where you're physically stationary, and you'd be able to do that in a way that was kind of visually engaging and kind of immersive. So I'd like to see these kinds of things continue.
Yeah.
When you said that, I thought we've really gone full circle, because in the past we had to go to the arcades to play the newest games, and then the marketing strategy was to say you can play the arcade games at home, and now at home we're digitally going to the arcades.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's kind of everything comes around again.
I think that's a really good idea, particularly given that like the way that Netflix and other streaming services use VR is by recreating like a really nice living room or a cinema, right? I think that people would actually, especially in the hell time that we're living in now, would love to be able to move around in a recreation of an arcade. You know, you could put humans in it, and then people could feel like they were in a populated space, and then they could like, you know, stand or sit at the cabinet of their choice and just, you know, play a retro game that does not need to be in a 3D space at all, and yet is somehow enhanced by the fact that you can, like, you know, get up right real close and look at the cabinet and see the gunge that's collecting around the buttons.
Too bad we don't have smell-o-vision or anything like that yet, so we won't have the gross sweaty smells or anything like that. Or, you know, I'm just thinking, you know, the same adaptation of an arcade could be used for like a casino lounge and have casinos everywhere, and
Don't give them ideas.
Have the smoke everywhere, and
Stop
you know,
this
like
man
people
right now.
smoking.
Trev, we're going to shut you down here. We don't want to encourage casinos on this here podcast.
You know, I'm just from the country. You know, we do things differently out here.
They'd be bad, but arcades are good.
There's a couple of things on that note that I think Arcade Stadium is missing. One of them is that there is this very nice new music that plays in the sort of menu while you're selecting your game, which is it's a new arrangement, and it's, you know, it's fine, it's good, it does what it needs to. I think there should at least be the option of just hearing that clamor of all the different cabinets and their demo screens all playing their music at once, and just that kind of cacophony when you walk into an arcade.
Yeah, arcades had a very special soundscape, and they should definitely have captured that.
I think that would be really cool to have. And the other thing, it doesn't have like the actual cabinet art anywhere as far as I've seen. So it's kind of, there are a variety of different actual cabinets themselves that you can unlock, which are all based on the different designs of various cabinets and stuff, but none of them have, you know, those marquees that and the playing instructions and all that kind of stuff, which I think is a missed opportunity too.
I think one thing that they could, one thing that I'd like to see them to kind of extend in your idea there, Matt, and one thing I'd like to see them do with these things is take them more seriously as a kind of a virtual museum as well. There was this really wonderful, and it's been closed ever since. About 6 years ago, when I was in Japan, I went to one of the regional cities, and they had a kind of a museum to old arcade games and pinball tables in there. And they had like 60 pinball tables and like 100 old arcade games. We're talking really old ones here. And on each of them, there was like this little description there, which was not just how to play the game, but there was like this little writing explaining what the game was and its historical influence and, you know, that kind of thing. And I would love to see them do that with these kinds of museums, like explain this game was designed by this person, they were looking to do this with it, it was this successful, sold this many units, all that kind of stuff. Just capture not just the game itself, which is kind of self-evidently good with most of these games anyway, but also just bring context into it, because I think we're at that point now where the older games in the video game industry are, as works of art, something worth preserving for their cultural heritage and value. And I think we're losing that a little bit, that we're not also preserving kind of the conversation around those games, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like that's such an afterthought, because there's some compilations that are very good with this and have everything unlockable and really well connected to the game. And there are some compilations where they just don't put anything up, or they'll put a soundtrack, or they'll put like an additional promotional art or something, and just call it a day. And I wish you're right, I wish there was much more commitment to preserving all that side of things.
I mean, Capcom themselves did it with the previous release, their Street Fighter collection, which is an absolutely spectacular collection of games. And I say that
which one do you mean? The one with all of Street Fighter 2 and 3, or the one with just Street Fighter 2?
No, the one with all of Street Fighter 2 and 3. It was released on the Switch about 2 years ago. It was like 15 Street Fighter games. And I say this as somebody who wasn't a big fan of Street Fighter. I love that package because it had like huge amounts of additional information and concept art, and I think it had concept art. It had this like real weight of material behind it to explain why these games are worth preserving. And that one, I've been waiting for another developer to start doing that in their games, and they just don't. I don't know why. I assume they have access to this material and they just don't do it. I don't know why.
The Samurai Showdown collection that came out last year did the same thing.
Oh, did it?
It's got a really good. It's got, like concept art and design documents and kind of old interview footage that they've managed to dig up.
That's the one I didn't play. I'll have to grab that one just to support that. That's a good thing. Like
video, like old tournament footage from. Yeah, it's a really like they went kind of above and beyond on that one to fit as much of that kind of stuff in as they could find.
Well, I think they should. I mean, I think that's part of the appeal of these things. It's kind of tapping into people's love of these old games and explaining to newer players, why they were so respected. I was so annoyed by the Space Invaders one, and I love that Space Invaders collection. I play it a lot because I love Space Invaders, but all it is like 7 or 8 games, and they're just listed on a menu, and you just select the one you want to play, and you play well, you get on the leaderboard, but that's it. And there's just so much behind Space Invaders that they could do, and they just ignored all of that. So,
going back to your thing about preserving sort of spaces and stuff like that, I had kind of the idea of like, because you started veering onto like cabinets and stuff, but what about if they like have real world locations for in the VR space? Like it's like, well, experience this like arcade from like how it was in the 80s, and then it has like all the arcades and stuff, but it's like a real world space in VR. That would be
well. And I really think there would be interest in recreating some of the more interesting arcades, because arcades are on their way out now. They're going, gone. There aren't that many of them left. Even in Japan, they're closing down. And preserving the ones that were interesting, like the one I mentioned in Kawasaki City, which was designed after Carl Uno. There are a lot of arcades that were quite interesting in terms of how they were designed and laid out and stuff. And actually recreating those in a VR space would be worth doing, I think.
One more thing that I was interested with the Capcom collection, and I think, Matt, when you were talking about the Samurai Shodown collection, maybe this is what they were trying to do. The whole thing with arcade games was you would kind of learn how to play the game with the people at the arcade, and it was just the collaborative effort of trying to get bang for your buck and not lose your money to greedy Konami or whatever. And people would teach you what was the best way to do combos and fighting games or to play well in shmups. And I'm a bit younger, and I realized that I don't know how to play shmups. I know how to move my ship around, and I know how to shoot, but I don't know how to get the high scores. I had to look up YouTube videos on how people did it, and I wish there was some kind of way to replicate that as well. Maybe just game footage or a demo mode or hints and tips or something, so you can learn how to get really good at the game.
The SNK collection that came out a couple of years ago, I think, did a kind of interesting thing with that where there was an option you could just watch an expert playthrough.
Yeah, there was a perfect run that was built into every game,
which you could then
you could drop. You could drop in and out of. So if you're struggling with a boss, you could drop out just before the boss battle, watch the kind of the perfect run, deal with the boss, and then drop back in again afterwards, and you could learn the tactics for beating the boss that way. That was pretty cool. In an otherwise pretty pedestrian package. I thought that was a pretty good feature.
Yeah, I think apparently the Blizzard one that just came out last week. I haven't played it, but apparently it has the same kind of thing.
Oh, does it?
I do really want to try that. There's only 3 games on it though, right? There's Blackthorn and the Lost Vikings and this other one.
I kind of feel sorry for Blizzard because, except I don't because it's Blizzard. But
I was gonna say.
But yeah, releasing that arcade collection, which is objectively 3 good games there, but doing it after Capcom just dumps like its entire history on arcade fans was just not great timing for them.
Also, like, none of those were actually arcade games when they came out, right? Like, they were like Mega Drive and Super Nintendo games.
Were they?
Yeah, there was no like arcade cabinet version of Lost Vikings or of Rock and Roll Racing. They were straight to console.
See, this is why I do not like Blizzard. They play tricks with their. They play tricks. They're a nasty company.
They're riding on that nostalgia.
Yeah.
But saying that, I can't wait to play Diablo 2.
Yeah. But I mean, those are all like as you say, they're all great games. Like, I'm extremely tempted just for Rock and Roll Racing again. Like that thing whipped. But yeah, I saw their presentation and I saw they're actually using arcade cabinets, and I was just like, what alternate reality are you presenting to me? I was there. I was alive.
Of all the evil things Blizzard could do, convincing you, Lee, that they released an arcade version of a game that you know didn't exist is really low on the list of profitability for evil schemes.
Yeah, well, that's just how, like, the kind of resources they've got access to, right? Now it's individually driving people up the wall.
Yeah, that's it. They're just targeting people. They've got data on you, Lee, and they just specifically did it to get you.
Their next project, Matt, is to get a Miku license so they can make a Miku Battle Royale.
Don't you dare.
And say it was on the arcade.
Miku Arcade was really good. I mean, jokes aside, the popularity of Miku Arcade just goes to show just how much people do still love their arcade games, because that Miku release on the Switch, you could buy a full recreation of the arcade controller for it, and that controller was $800, I want to say, and it sold out.
Isn't it a 4-button game?
Yeah.
And swipe buttons.
Why do you need a...
Because in the arcade they're big and glowy. Yeah.
Big and glowy and easier to hit.
Okay.
But I guess that's kind of the next step. I mean, I wonder if we're going to get to the point where these companies realize that people actually still want the full arcade cabinet. I know you can get the mini ones at the moment, but I'm sure at some point Capcom or Konami or anyone that also has a big range of old retro kind of arcade games will actually recreate these arcade cabinets for home use, and they'll charge you $1,500 for them or whatever, and people will buy them.
That's not my problem, is that I grew up in the era where arcades were on their way out, and so developers were thinking, okay, what experience can we give them that they can't already get at home? And so I grew up with all the big, chunky, strange controller games like Bishi Boshio and Time Crisis, and that is gone forever. I will never experience anything like that ever again.
Yeah, and all the great little horror, all the great horror games where you actually be inside
horror,
you'd be in the booth, and those would be impossible to recreate in a way that's interesting in home video games.
I'd love to play like a Luigi's Mansion arcade at home.
They actually did a Luigi's Mansion arcade.
Yeah, they did.
Yes.
With a full like vacuum like headset, and I think they did. They might have been 3D, maybe not. But yeah, it was a full, the cabinet, you go inside and it blasts you with air while you're in there, and I want that. I want to plug that into my Switch.
See, I like that because I like the cabinet games which still exist, which are like the water one. You shoot like water and it like kills like the monsters on the screen. I like that one because that's fun and it's like interactive and you got like real world like AI stuff. Like, yeah, I like that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's what they get you. Is like you can't get that at home, so you have to come out to the arcade for it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that was sustaining arcades were the UFO catchers. And unfortunately for the arcades, you can even do that at home now. You can actually get apps. You can actually get apps to manually control the UFO catchers remotely, and a lot of people in Japan are actually just playing these UFO catchers now on their apps. And when they win the prize, it gets mailed out to them as is afterwards. And it's pretty, like, I've used one. It's pretty good. Like, it works right. And if you're the UFO catcher prizes in Japan are of a different league to in Australia. So in Australia, the few UFO catchers we still have are always Pokemon stuffed toy rip-offs, which are not official by any means, and certainly don't look like they were made by anybody with any quality control. But in Japan, you get figures and huge plushes, and these are all kind of official products of their companies. And if you're into those things, you've got to spend a lot of money on them. I know I tried to get some of the Miku figures while I've been over there, and yeah, the UFO thing was still a big reason that arcades were still doing strong in Japan, but now that you can do that from home, that's another blow to the industry as such. It's all going on its way out, unfortunately. And on that happy note, we'll go to some music, and we'll come back and talk about something else. The music we'll use is maybe that title screen from the
Arcade Stadium theme. Oh, yeah. It's such a good song.
And welcome back, everybody. Okay, so for the final section of the podcast this week, we have got a special guest, Lee, on. So we're going to just ask him questions. We're going to do the journalist thing. We're going to be interviewers. You ready, Lee?
Yeah, go for it.
Right. No, I was going to say something very... I was going to ask you a very hard question, but I won't.
Oh, well. We'll work our way up to it.
Yeah.
Okay, pineapples on pizza. Go. Answer.
I used to be against it, but I've come around in like the last year or two because there's a very good like Supreme pizza that is in my neighborhood, which is all about pineapple and it works. Which I know is, that's a heathen response, but I'm into it these days.
No, it's actually mandatory on digitallydownloaded.net that you like pineapple on pizza.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, it's a rule. Yeah. No, okay, but in all seriousness, so you've been around in the Australian industry for long enough now. Can we call you a veteran? I guess we can. You get to be a veteran now.
I'm old at least, so there's that. Yeah.
So you've gone through it all, really. So you've created games that have been very popular or at least very well received by the communities. You've had the less than pleasant experience of being in a studio that has closed its doors. I guess my first question for you would be, in terms of the Australian video game industry, how did that feel? Like when Defiant kind of closed up, given that the industry here is relatively small, that must have been a concerning couple of months for you trying to look for more work after that. And then you've learned it in this kind of, is it fair to call you a freelancer now? Yeah,
I'm a freelancer these days, and reasonably comfortably so. So that's good. But yeah, to answer the question, it was a real surprise, I think, because Defiant for a good many years certainly presented itself as being in a strong position and used that clout and that success to attempt to bolster the local industry and present the Australian industry as being strong. And so to discover that that we were essentially a couple of weird deals away from being completely shuttered just came out of nowhere. So yeah, it was a shock, and it was a struggle because I wasn't really sure where I'd be able to find the same kind of opportunities that were being offered to me there. And it was a couple of desperate months, certainly. I remember that was July of 2019, and things were looking quite bleak for me for a while. Like I went along to the PAX Oz of that year. It was like the first one in ages where I was like, okay, I desperately need to like connect with people and like try and sort something out. Like I had a real like plan to weasel my way into someone else's games, and none of that panned out. And then like the week that I got back, I was offered like 2 different jobs locally, and those have helped keep the wolves at bay. And will likely lead into ongoing stuff. But yeah, the games industry in Australia is so like there are a bunch of really strong communities, but if you are not attached to them in any way, it becomes a lot harder to find work. And fortunately, I've been connected enough through both working at Defiant and being press before that. I've hosted a radio program in Brisbane for like 10 years, so I've been able to like to be an entity within the Australian games industry for a while, which made it a little bit easier for me to keep paying my mortgage. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that's always kind of interested me about the Australian industry is that it has traditionally been quite small. I mean, it had that period where it was fairly healthy because all the international studios had local guys, local outfits. But with the GFC, that all went away. The perception I have now is that things are starting to get better again, in the sense that there are more games being made. There seems to be a fair few studios out there that are fairly bullish in terms of recruitment, and there are a couple of big entities coming back. Activision set up one down in Melbourne and stuff. So, and there's been a couple of big acquisitions as well. So
Yes.
it seems like there is money back in the industry now, which is good for people who are maybe not attached to studios such as yourself, in terms of there may be a good range of opportunities coming up.
Yeah. Particularly if you are a little bit established, I think you're in a position where maybe there's the chance to, at least, choose from one or two options, which is nice. But it is still an industry that employs, I think, around 1,000 people, like nationally, which is, nothing at all. And has such a disparity in the way that, like, games funding exists from state to state. Like that is such an influence over not just the kinds of games that get made in Australia, but also the kinds of people who are able to make them as well. So hopefully, one day we'll get a bit more uniformity in as much as, like, the way that the industry gets supported nationally as well as on a state level. Like, I think that will open it up once again, and I have hope that things are heading in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of good if you're based in Melbourne but nowhere else.
Yeah,
as far as the Australian industry is concerned, because the Victorian government, all by itself, does a lot with video game industry, and there's also the supporting networks around it, like ACMI constantly does things with video games to highlight the local industry. You've got all the the sporting bodies that are involved with video games that are all based out of Melbourne. So the entire infrastructure around video games seems much healthier there than anywhere else.
Yes. Yeah, which is good and bad. Like, it's an amazing opportunity for all of those devs, but it does sort of mean that the industry itself, at least the communication that happens around it, seems to be focused on the fact that, like, all of the independent development in Australia exists within Melbourne, and all of the the AAA stuff exists within Sydney, just because, like, that's where all the press and the bigger the more traditional studios have had their offices, which is difficult for, like Brisbane and Queensland has a reasonably strong industry, but you look at like South Australia and Western Australia, where they've got amazing new programs being put together, and it's just not getting the attention that it really deserves. That sort of that Melbourne focus that Australia is really enjoys, is sort of like both a wonderful source of fantastic work in the games industry, but also, like, terrible frustration when you're desperately trying to get people to pay attention to what else is being produced here.
Yeah, it's kind of like a black hole, isn't it? It kind of sucks everything in. And you're right. I mean, Adelaide has, South Australia's done some big things with video games. Like, the government itself has been quite willing to support the industry, as we've seen. They had a pretty big initiative that they announced last year in terms of funding, or at least helping studios. And Perth, I mean, Perth's an interesting one. Even somebody like me who covers the industry a great deal, I can only name one developer I know out of Perth, and that's Black Lab. And they obviously have the Battlestar Galactica and now Warhammer games, but I can't think of anybody else that kind of makes games out there, and that's not good for me. I'm sure there are other studios I should be aware of, but you're right. I mean, the focus is definitely on Melbourne and what the Melbourne studios are coming up with. Did you ever feel like you might need to move overseas? Was that ever an option for you?
Yeah, it's been a thing that has been sort of a threat more than anything. Like, I didn't want to. I really, my hope was that when Defiant shut, that I'd be able to figure out a way of, being able to do what I do and stay where I am. And, like, morbidly, like, COVID has made that much more viable now. I think that the hope is that studios want to be able to just get back into the same building again. But for the foreseeable future, I think, certainly the sort of like narrative roles that I'm interested in are things that people will be willing to do at a distance. But yeah, I've looked at it. There are places in the world that I would love to move to or live in for a while. Not America so much, but there are amazing studios across Europe and Japan as well that would be just amazing places to really learn how things are done in the rest of the world as well. But for now, I'm Australian based and hopefully for the foreseeable future.
So how have you found the kind of the freelance experience? Has it been a rewarding kind of process?
Yes, yeah. I've been lucky enough to be working on, one or two things at any given time, which has allowed me to get a bunch of experience under my belt that I hadn't had before, and do a bunch of things that, are very rite of passagey in like games writing in particular. So within the last 18 months, I think I've basically covered everything that a narrative designer wants to do, or then is forced to do because no one ever wants to sit down and write item descriptions. But I really love them, and now I find, having had to do hundreds and hundreds of them, I now read them every time I'm in my inventory in a video game, just to make sure that whoever was me on that game gets their due. But yeah, freelancing is it's nice being able to work at home with my dog in his little dog bed 2 meters away from my desk. And I enjoy the flexibility that it offers. But I have been able to go into a studio a couple of times a week the last couple of months to crank out the final work on a project that I cannot talk about at all. And it's been nice being in a collaborative space again. It's much easier to solve problems when you're face to face. That said, commuting can still completely screw itself. I was sick of the process of having to go to work again within 3 days. So
yeah, the commuters are. Yeah. That's the worst thing. There was a time that I was doing an hour and a half commute each way for a job that I was doing, and it was just not fun. It wasn't enjoyable on any level. Okay, I have a question about what you actually do rather than your background. Narrative, working in narrative, just how much creative control do you end up getting?
It depends on the point at which I'm brought onto a project.
Right.
So for something like Windbound, I came on as a writer after the initial narrative had been established by the creative lead in the studio, as well as Mel T, who was another designer who'd been brought on to help shape that world. And so there was a lot of stuff that had already been set in place, but I was also given a lot of flexibility to kind of find my own stories within what had already been built up around it. And I really enjoy working within other people's established story spaces and picking away at the things that maybe they've just sort of placed there without touching too much. I like playing with other people's toys. I try to be respectful, but I also pulling them apart a bit just so that I can figure out how to reconstruct them again. I've kind of done both. I've worked on stuff under creative leads who have had very strong visions. I've also been able to help refine the voice of characters. And last year I also was I did some consulting for Witchbeam, who are a wonderful Australian game dev that did a game called Assault Android Cactus and are working on Unpacking now. And so they've split off their devs on multiple projects now, and they're working on a puzzle game, which looks very exciting. That I can talk about a little bit because that's been announced, called Tempopo, and I was like just chatting with their lead designer over coffee. We were catching up, and he mentioned one of the difficulties that he was having with they'd worked out all the mechanics for their game, but they couldn't figure out how to tie it together narratively. And I made an offhand comment about how it should be about growing a garden of animate plants that were also musical instruments. And he was, he and I are pals, so I was just going to let him have that one for free. And I think he felt morally obliged to hire me on to flesh that idea out because he was going to steal it either way. So I got paid to fill that idea out. And that was nice. That was a good favor. But it really all does depend on when you're brought on. And a lot of games companies do sort of view writing as something that can happen in the last couple of months. We've built this game and we need to work out what all these things say now, which is a fun challenge, but also kind of bullshit.
It's funny you mentioned that because we actually talked about that. I think it was on last month's podcast. That it's quite noticeable in a lot of cases, more so with the AAA space, I guess, that a lot of times they kind of shove the narrative in to just make something work for the game that's already been designed.
Yeah.
And I don't know, my personal preference is I prefer when the narrative is more integrated into the actual concept of the game as well, and the mechanics are built around telling that story a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think it works the other way around as well, is that when you bring the writer in early on, they can, if you have established mechanics you want to work with, it's a lot of fun to try to figure out narratively how those things work. You can create really unique worlds and stories around these, even just, mechanical things that you want to do in a video game. It's much better being able to have that set early on rather than having to try and justify it at the last minute.
Sure. All right. Given that you are a narrative designer, what is the narrative I think that you want to do the most? I mean, if you got to work on a dream project, what would that look like?
I think that there are not enough attempts at recreating the Yakuza style game experience. They're hugely popular. Yakuza is probably my favorite game series, and no one is doing a Yakuza which I find really, really interesting, because to me, I think there's a really interesting mix of there's a very personal, community-based storytelling, as well as being able to grab someone by the face and hit them against a lamppost. I think that there actually is some kind of magic that exists at the crossroads between beat 'em up and community-based storytelling, and I think more people should be trying to do a Yakuza as a I want to see what the indie take on that is. I want to see how people can really unpick those to work out because there's so much going on in Yakuza games that even attempting to understand and recreate a tiny facet, I think is going to yield really interesting results. And I hope that there's going to be some of that influence happening at some point in the future.
Yeah, I just wonder if the reason that we haven't seen many other attempts at doing Yakuza, particularly from the indies, is just that looking at them there from a design perspective, from a narrative perspective, they're just so overwhelming in scope. I mean, I actually think that a lot of people don't give enough credit to the Yakuza series that it's due, because I think a lot of people look at it as relatively small, open worlds, and it's easy to take for granted a lot of the stuff that goes on in those games. But you've got this perfect balance between fairly serious main narrative and completely oddball side quests and side stories. You've got this really intense mix of humor and extreme violence and sex, and it all kind of comes together. You've got this underground concept, but you need to elevate these characters so they're kind of heroic. And on top of all of that, you've got to mix in all of these mini games. A lot of them have their own little narrative arcs as well. And it just thinking, if I even sit to think about what goes into a Yakuza game on any level, I'm just absolutely amazed by how it actually comes together, because if any one of those elements is wrong, the whole thing just falls apart. And they just never get it wrong. I don't know how they've managed to do it across like 6. It's not just that. It's not just the 6 Yakuza games. They've also done that spin-off, which was Judgment, which was the same thing. And they've gone and done a Fist of the North Star game, which is in the exact same style. And they've just nailed it with that one as well. I just don't know how they managed to keep it up. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is. It's impressive that they can keep reapplying that formula, and they can keep, saying, "Hey, we're going back to Shinjuku again. I hope you really enjoy this environment," and I do. I love it. It's like every time they keep saying we're just refining the same section of Kabukicho. It's like, I just please keep taking me back there.
It's really
thing. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, it's also always like the small things that gets me with these games. It's like I get homesick because obviously I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and I really love being in the country. I get homesick every time I walk into a convenience store, because the convenience stores, the way they've designed them, and just the experience of walking into a convenience store is a spot-on recreation of the experience of walking into a convenience store in Japan. And that's different to what we have in Australia or whatever. You walk into a convenience store here, you're going to get ripped off for buying a Coke, but over there it's a different experience. And it's just those kind of little tiny things, the authenticity that just comes into these games, that just makes the whole space so believable and so enjoyable to walk around. It doesn't just happen. I think a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people take it for granted, but it doesn't just happen. Even within the context of Japanese developers making a game about their own country, it doesn't just happen.
Yeah. I think that there's so much going on within them. That again, taking a look at any one element of that, like that recreation of a space, Dotonbori is like my favorite place in the world. I love Osaka in general and Dotonbori specifically, and so seeing that recreated so faithfully in Yakuza's 2 and 4 and 5 and is just like amazing. But that's something that other people can attempt, and I think could be done extremely well. That loving recreation of such a new an iconic space, that someone has a real personal connection to. I would love to see someone else just be like, this is a neighborhood that I know and love, and I have ground it down to its essence, and now you can explore it. You might not be able to go into every building, but maybe you can get a sense of what it is that makes just my suburb a fascinating place, or something along those lines would be really interesting.
Have to get somebody to do like the Rocks in Sydney.
Yeah, like an Australian one where you've got like the small, like instead of like 7-Eleven, you have like some small little corner store in a little suburb. We're selling meat and like newspapers and ripping you off with lollies.
Yeah. Like, how good would that be, though? Like, if to go in there and you would know exactly like what kinds of like, lollies are going to be in the jars in the counter, right? You know that you can turn around and like open up the ice cream freezer and grab a Bubble-O Bill. That's going to convey some kind of bonus on you. Like, all of that stuff is just wonderful, and I want to see more people trying to like gamify their own little neighborhoods.
They could make one of the challenges trying to get somewhere on time and have to use the Sydney transport system.
Perfect.
Yeah, I was gonna say the most perfect thing about Yakuza is that every single ad campaign that Sega makes for it seems to have trouble capturing all of the craziness, and the most effective promotion for that game so far has just been Bakamitai and a Japanese man in a suit singing an old power ballad in karaoke. Captures the feeling of the game so much better than anything else I could ever use to describe it. Like, when I heard that song and saw that video, I was like, I get it now. I understand what they're doing with this.
Yep, 100%.
And on that note, we might give this podcast a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us, Lee. That was really interesting. Good stuff. Good content. I said the C word. But yeah, thank you very much again for being on. It's always a joy to talk with you, and best of luck with your next games. We look forward to hearing more about them once they are formally announced, and I'm sure we'll be in touch to talk about your role in them again at some point. Otherwise, everybody else have a great month in the month of gaming ahead. Enjoy your games. Thanks as always for tuning in, and we will see you next time. We're going to finish up with some music from Yakuza, I think, since we're talking about that. We might just use the street sounds. No, we'll get some music.
Some arcade music.
Yeah, some arcade music. Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.